coming up on 8 o'clock, so we should be able to get back into the swing of things. Welcome back. This is our third reading from Thoreau's Walden. After the first session, it has gotten better. It's been a lot of old men yelling at dead men for a while, and my camera decided that it wanted to go out. So just a moment, let me fix that, because that's a lovely screen there where it gets stuck. Come on. There we go. Maybe? Nope. Okay, is my mic going out? Now will we stay? No. Alright, we might be in for a hard time. Hang on, let me... It's gonna be one of those nights, I think. So, let's go ahead and hide this for now while I troubleshoot the old mic. Or the camera, I should say. Are we alright? Let's see. Looking okay so far. Alright, I think we're back in action. So yeah, we are, it's our just, you know, regularly scheduled stuff. Anyway, so, and it went, again, for Christ's sake. Is my USB going bad? Track out which one it's going to. Alright, let's go ahead and give this another try. Swapped it to another port, wonder if it's just the USB port or if the camera's actually dying. It is an old, kind of crappy webcam, but we'll see what we've got to deal with. Anyway, back to what we're talking about. This is our third night at Thoreau for our reading of Walden. So we got over the hump that was the first session. The first chapter was pretty rough. As we've all come to learn, Thoreau, kind of a pretentious asshole. Getting very big. I took a philosophy 102 class and all of a sudden I know the answer to everything in the world sort of vibes from him. So we're dealing with that. But it has gotten better. It seems as they're, at least, either it's getting better or we're getting used to it. In any case though, we'll just go ahead and have to suffer through it together, right? I think Akamos had mentioned it. We've had a good string of books that we've all enjoyed so far. So having one that is a contrast point is worthwhile. So let's go ahead and just jump back into it, and we will see what we'll see. Whether Thoreau will redeem himself, or if we'll just get angry and yell at someone who is 100 years dead. I'd get even odds either direction at this point, honestly. So let's go ahead and get into the next section of Walden, entitled Sounds. But while we are confined to books, though the most select and classic, and read only particularly written languages, which are themselves but dialects and provincial, we are in danger of forgetting the language which all things and events speak without metaphor, which alone is copious and standard. Much is published, but little printed. The rays which stream through the shutter will be no longer remembered when the shutter is wholly removed. No method nor discipline can supersede the necessity of being forever on the alert. What is a course of history or philosophy or poetry, no matter how well selected, or the best society, or the best admirable routine of life, compared with the discipline of looking always at what is to be seen? Will you be a reader, a student merely, or a seer? Read your fate, see what is before you, and walk on into futurity. I did not read books the first summer. I hoed beans. Nay, I often did better than this. There were times when I could not afford to sacrifice the bloom of the present moment to any work, whether of the head or hands. I love a broad margin to my life. Sometimes, in the summer morning, having taken my accustomed bath, I sat in my sunny doorway from sunrise till noon, wrapped in a reverie, amidst the pines and hickories and sumacs in undisturbed solitude and stillness, while the birds sing around or flitted noiselessly through the house, until by the sun falling in at my west window, or the noise of some traveler's wagon on the distant highway, I was reminded of the lapse of time. I grew in those seasons like corn in the night, and they were far better than any work of the hands would have been. They were not time subtracted from my life, but so much over and above my usual allowance. I realized what the Orientals mean by contemplation and the forsaking of works. For the most part, I minded not how the hours went. The day advanced as if to light some work of mine. It was morning, and lo, now it is evening, and nothing memorable is accomplished. Instead of singing like the birds, I silently smiled at my incessant good fortune. As the sparrow had its trill sitting on the hickory before my door, so had I my chuckle or suppressed warble, which he might tear out of my nest. My days were not days of the week, bearing the stamp of any heathen deity, nor were they minced into hours and fretted by the ticking of a clock, for I lived like the Puri Indians, of whom it is said that for yesterday, today, and tomorrow they have only one word, and they express the variety of meaning by pointing backward for yesterday, forward for tomorrow, and overhead for the passing day. This was sheer idleness to my fellow townsmen, no doubt, but if the birds and flowers had tried me by their standard, I should not have been found wanting. A man must find his occasions in himself, it is true. The natural day is very calm, and will hardly reprove his indolence. Alright, so bro just disassociates for like entire seasons and thinks, yeah, this is life, this is good. It must be nice, I guess, to just be able to do absolutely nothing and think you're coming out the better for it. I had this advantage, at least in my mode of life, over those who were obliged to look abroad for amusement, to society and the theater, that my life itself was become my amusement, and never ceased to be novel. It was a drama of many scenes and without an end. If we were always indeed getting our living, and regulating our lives according to the last and best mode we had learned, we should never be troubled with ennui. Follow your genius closely enough, and it will not fail to show you a fresh prospect every hour. Housework was a pleasant pastime. When my floor was dirty, I rose early, and, setting all my furniture out of doors on the grass, bed and bedstead making but one budget, dashed water on the floor and sprinkled white sand from the pond on it, and then, with a broom, scrubbed it clean and white, and by the time the villagers had broken their fast, the morning sun had dried my house sufficiently to allow me to move in again, and my meditations were almost uninterrupted. It was pleasant to see my whole household effects out on the grass, making a little pile like a gypsy's pack, and my three-legged table, from which I did not remove the books and pen and ink, standing amid the pines and hickories. They seemed glad to get out themselves, and as if unwilling to be brought in. I was sometimes tempted to stretch an awning over them and take my seat there. It was worth the while to see the sun shine on these things, and hear the free wind blow on them. So much more interesting. Most familiar objects look out of doors than in the house. A bird sits on the next bough. Life everlasting grows under the table, and blackberry vines run round its legs. Pine cones, chestnut burrs, and strawberry leaves are strewn about. It looked as if this was the way these forms came to be transferred to our furniture, to tables, chairs, and bedsteads, because they once stood in their midst. My house was on the side of a hill, immediately on the edge of the larger wood, in the midst of a young forest of pitch pines and hickories. and half a dozen rods from the pond to which a narrow footpath led down the hill. In my front yard grew the strawberry, blackberry, and life everlasting, johnswort and goldenrod, shrub oaks and sandcherry, blueberry and groundnut. Near the end of May, the sandcherry, Cerastus pumila, adorned the sides of the path with its delicate flowers arranged in umbels cylindrically about its short stems, which last, in the fall, weighed down with good-sized and handsome cherries, fell over in wreaths like rays on every side. I tasted them out of compliment to nature, though they were scarcely palatable. The sumac, Rus glabra, grew luxuriantly around the house, pushing up through the embankment which I had made, and growing 5 or 6 feet the first season. Its broad, pinnate tropical leaf was pleasant, though strange to look on. The large buds, suddenly pushing out late in the spring from dry sticks which had seemed to be dead, developed themselves as by magic into graceful green and tender boughs, an inch in diameter, and sometimes, as I sat at my window, so heedlessly did they grow and tax their weak joints, I heard a fresh and tender bough suddenly fall like a fan to the ground, when there was not a breath of air stirring, broken off by its own weight. In August, the large masses of berries, which, when in flower, had attracted many wild bees, gradually assumed their bright velvety crimson hue, and by their weight again bent down and broke their tender limbs. As I sit at my window this summer afternoon, hawks are circling about my clearing, the tantivity of wild pigeons, flying by 2s and 3s athwart my view, or perching restless on the white pine boughs behind my house, give a voice to the air. A fishhawk dimples the glassy surface of the pond and brings up a fish. A mink steals out of the marsh before my door and seizes a frog by the shore. The sedge is bending under the weight of the reed birds flitting hither and thither. And for the last half hour I've heard the rattle of railroad cars, now dying away and then reviving like the beat of a partridge, conveying travelers from Boston to the country. For I did not live so out of the world as that boy who, as I hear, was put out to a farmer in the east part of the town, but ere long ran away and came home again, quite down to the heel and homesick. He had never seen such dull and out-of-the-way place. The folks were all gone off. Why, you couldn't even hear the whistle. I doubt if there is such a place in Massachusetts now. In truth, our village has become a butt for one of those fleet railroad shafts, and o'er our peaceful plain its soothing sound is concord. The Fitchburg Railroad touches the pond about 100 rods south of where I dwell. I usually go to the village along its causeway, and am, as it were, related to society by this link. The men on the freight trains, who go over the whole length of the road, bow to me as to an old acquaintance. They pass me so often, and, apparently, they take me for an employee, and so I am. I, too, would fain to be a track repairer somewhere in the orbit of the earth. The whistle of the locomotive penetrates my woods summer and winter, sounding like the scream of a hawk sailing over some farmer's yard, informing me that many restless city merchants are arriving within the circle of the town, or adventurous country traders from the other side. As they come under one horizon, they shout their warning to get off the track to the other, heard sometimes through the circles of two towns. Here come your groceries, country, your rations, countrymen. Nor is there any man so independent on his farm that he can say them nay. And here's your pay for them, screams the countryman's whistle. Timber like long battering rams going 20 miles an hour against the city's walls, and chairs enough to seat all the weary and heavy laden that dwell within them. With such huge and lumbering civility, the country hands a chair to the city. All the Indian huckleberry hills are stripped, all the cranberry meadows are raked into the city. Up comes the cotton, down goes the woven cloth, up comes the silk, down goes the woolen, up come the books, but down goes the wits that write them. When I meet the engine, with its train of cars moving off with planetary motion, or rather, like a comet, for the beholder knows not if with that velocity and with that direction it will ever revisit this system, since the orbit does not look like a returning curve, with its steam cloud like a banner streaming behind in golden and silver wreaths, like many a downy cloud which I have seen, high in the heavens, unfolding its masses to the light, as if this traveling demigod, this cloud compeller, would ere long take the sunset sky for the livery of his train. When I hear the iron horse make the hills echo with his snort like thunder, shaking the earth with his feet, and breathing fire and smoke from his nostrils, What kind of winged horse or fiery dragon they will put into the new mythology, I don't know. It seems as if the earth had got a race now worthy to inhabit it. If all were as it seems, and men made the elements their servants for noble ends. If the cloud that hangs over the engine were the perspiration of heroic deeds, or as beneficent as that which floats over the farmer's fields, then the elements and nature herself would cheerfully accompany men on their errands and be their escort. I watch the passage of the morning cars with the same feeling that I do the rising of the sun, which is hardly more regular. Their train of clouds stretching far behind and rising higher and higher, going to heaven, while the cars are going to Boston, conceals the sun for a minute and casts my distant field into the shade. A celestial train, beside which the petty train of cars which hugs the earth is but the barb of the spear. The stabler of the iron horse was up early this winter morning by the light of the stars amid the mountains, to fodder and harness his steed. Fire, too, was awakened thus early, to put the vital heat in him and get him off. If the enterprise were as innocent as it is early, if the snow lies deep, they strap on his snowshoes, and with the giant plow a furrow from the mountains to the seaboard, in which the cars, like a following drill barrow, sprinkle all the restless men and floating merchandise in the country for seed. All day the fire steed flies over the country, stopping only that his master may rest. And I am awakened by this tramp and defiant snort at midnight, when in some remote glen in the woods he fronts the elements encased in ice and snow, and he will reach his stall only with the morning star, to start once more on his travels without rest or slumber. Or, perchance, at evening, I hear him in his stable blowing off the superfluous energy of the day, that he may calm his nerves and cool his liver and brain for a few hours of iron slumber. If the enterprise were as heroic and commanding as it is protracted and unwearied. Thoreau is much more romantic about the train that goes through his backyard than I am. Mine doesn't blow the horn, but you can feel it rumble all through the house. When that happens at 4 in the morning, I'm not as charitable. No, not so romantic about the train. Far through unfrequented woods on the confines of towns, where once only the hunter penetrated by day, in the darkest night dart these bright saloons without the knowledge of their inhabitants. This moment stopping at some brilliant station house in town or city, where a social crowd is gathered. The next in the dismal swamp, scaring the owl and fox. The startings and arrivals of the cars are now the epochs in the village day. They go and come with such regularity and precision, and their whistles can be heard so far that the farmers set their clocks by them, and thus one well-conducted institution regulates a whole country. Have not men improved somewhat in punctuality since the railroad was invented? Do they not talk and think faster in the depot than they did in the stage office? There is something electrifying in the atmosphere of the former place. I've been astonished at the miracles it has wrought, that some of my neighbors who I should have prophesied once for all would never get to Boston by so prompt a conveyance are on hand when the bell rings. To do things railroad fashion is now the byword, and it is worth the while to be warned so often and so sincerely by any power to get off its track. There is no stopping to read the riot act, no firing over the heads of the mob. In this case, we have constructed a fate, an atropos, that never turns aside. Let that be the name of your engine. Men are advertised that at a certain hour and minute these bolts will be shot toward particular points of the compass. Yet it interferes with no man's business, and the children go to school on the other track. We live the steadier for it, and are all educated thus to be sons of Tell. The air is full of invisible bolts. Every path but your own is the path of fate. Keep on your own track, then. What recommends commerce to me is its enterprise and bravery. It does not clasp its hands and pray to Jupiter. I see these men every day go about their business with more or less courage and content, doing more even than they suspect. Nope. I think so far we're okay. I think it might just be YouTube. I don't have dropped frames on OBS. But I think we're okay. Oh, no, I dropped off live for a minute. I'll catch back up. Alright, I think we're back. Let's just take that paragraph from the top then. What recommends commerce to me is its enterprise and bravery. It does not clasp its hands and pray to Jupiter. I see these men every day go about their business, with more or less courage and content, doing more even than they suspect, and perchance better employed than they could have consciously devised. I am less affected by their heroism, who stood up for half an hour in the front line at Buena Vista, than by the steady and cheerful valor of the men who inhabit the snowplow for their winter quarters, who have not merely the 3 o'clock in the morning courage, which Bonaparte thought was the rarest, but whose courage does not go to rest so early, who go to sleep only when the storm sleeps, or the sinews of their iron steed are frozen. On this morning of the great snow, perchance, which is still raging and chilling men's blood, I hear the muffled tone of their engine bell from out the fog bank of their chill breath, which announces that the cars are coming, without long delay, notwithstanding the veto of a New England northeast snowstorm, and I behold the plowmen covered with snow and rime, their heads peering above the mold board which is turning down other than daisies, and the nests of field mice like boulders of the Sierra Nevada that occupy an outside place in the universe. Commerce is unexpectedly confident and serene, alert, adventurous, and unwearied. It is very natural in its methods withal, far more so than many fantastic enterprises and sentimental experiments, and hence its singular success. I am refreshed and expanded when the freight train rattles past me, and I smell the stores which go dispensing their odors all the long way from Long Wharf to Lake Champlain, reminding me of foreign parts, of coral reefs and Indian oceans and tropical climes, and the extent of the globe. I feel more like a citizen of the world at the sight of the palm leaf, which will cover so many flaccid New England heads the next summer, the manila hemp and cocoa-nut husks, the old junk, gunny bags, scrap iron, and rusty nails. This carload of torn sails is more legible and interesting now than if they should be wrought into paper and printed books. Who can write so graphically the history of the storms they have weathered as these rents have done? They are proof sheets, which need no correction. Here goes lumber from the Maine woods, which did not go out to sea in the last freshet, risen $4 on the 1,000 because of what did go out was split up. Pine, spruce, cedar, first, second, third, or fourth qualities, so lately all of one quality, to wave over the bear and moose and caribou. Next rolls Thomaston lime, a prime lot, which will get far among the hills before it gets slacked. These rags and bales, of all hues and qualities, the lowest condition to which cotton and linen descend, the final results of dress, of patterns which are now no longer cried up, unless it be in Milwaukee, as those splendid articles, English, French, or American prints, ginghams, muslins, and etc., gathered from all quarters both of fashion and poverty, going to become paper of one color or a few shades only, on which, forsooth, will be written tales of real life, high and low, and founded on fact. This closed car smells of salt fish, the strong New England and commercial scent reminding me of the great banks in the fisheries. Who has not seen a saltfish, thoroughly cured for this world, so that nothing can spoil it, and putting the perseverance of the saints to the blush, with which you may sweep or pave the streets and split your kindlings, and the teamster shelter himself in his lading against the sun, wind, and rain behind it, and the trader, as a Concord trader once did, hang it up by his door for a sign when he commences business, until at last his oldest customer cannot tell surely whether it be animal, vegetable, or mineral, and yet it shall be as pure as a snowflake, and if it be put into a pot and boiled, will come out an excellent done fish for a Saturday's dinner. Next, Spanish hides, with the tails still preserving their twist and the angle of elevation they had when the oxen that wore them were careening over the pampas of the Spanish Main, a type of all obstinacy, and evincing how almost hopeless and incurable are all constitutional vices. I confess that, practically speaking, when I have learned a man's real disposition, I have no hopes of changing it for the better or worse in this state of existence. As the Orientals say, a cur's tail may be warmed, and pressed, and bound round with ligatures, and after a 12 years' labor bestowed upon it, still it will retain its natural form. The only effectual cure for such inveteracies as these tails exhibit is to make glue of them, which, I believe, is what is usually done with them, and then they will stay put and stick. Here is a hogshead of molasses, or of brandy directed to John Smith, Cuttingsville, Vermont, some trader among the Green Mountains, who imports for the farmers near his clearing, and now, perchance, stands over his bulkhead and thinks of the last arrivals on the coast, and how they may affect the price for him, telling his customers this moment, as he has told them 20 times before this morning, that he expects some by the next train of prime quality. It is advertised in the Cuttingville Times. While these things go up, other things come down. Warned by the whizzing sound, I look up from my book and see some tall pine hewn on the far northern hills, which has winged its way over the Green Mountains and the Connecticut, shot like an arrow through the township within 10 minutes, and scarce another eye beholds it, going to be the mast of some great admiral. And hark! Here comes the cattle train, bearing the cattle of 1,000 hills. Sheepcots, stables, and cow yards in the air, drovers with their sticks, and shepherd boys in the midst of all their flocks. All but the mountain pastures whirled along like leaves blown from the mountains by the September gales. The air is filled with the bleating of calves and sheep, and the hustling of oxen, as if a pastoral valley were going by. When the old bellwether at the head rattles his bell, the mountains do indeed skip like rams, and the little hills like lambs. A carload of drovers, too, in the midst, on a level with the droves now, their vocation gone, but still clinging to their useless sticks as their badge of office. But their dogs, where are they? It is a stampede to them. They are quite thrown out. They have lost the scent. Methinks I hear them barking behind Peterborough Hills, or panting up the western slope of the Green Mountains. They will not be in at the death. Their vocation, too, is gone. Their fidelity and sagacity are below par now. They will slink back to their kennels in disgrace, or perchance run wild and strike a league with the wolf and the fox. So is your pastoral life, whirled past and away. But the bell rings, and I must get off the track and let the cars go by. What's the railroad to me? I never go to see. Where it ends, it fills a few hollows, and makes banks for the swallows. It sets the sand a-blowing, and the blackberries a-growing. But I cross it like a cart path in the woods. I will not have my eyes put out and my ears spoiled by its smoke and steam and hissing. Now that the cars are gone by, and all the restless world with them, and the fishes in the pond no longer feel their rumbling, I am more alone than ever. For the rest of the long afternoon, perhaps, my meditations are interrupted only by the faint rattle of a carriage or team along the distant highway. Sometimes, on Sundays, I hear the bells, the Lincoln, Acton, Bedford, or Concord bell. When the wind was favorable, a faint, sweet, and, as it were, natural melody, worth importing into the wilderness. At a sufficient distance over the woods, this sound acquires a certain vibratory hum, as if the pine needles in the horizon were the strings of a harp which it swept. All sound heard at the greatest possible distance produces one and the same effect, a vibration of the universal lyre. Just as the intervening atmosphere makes a distant ridge of earth interesting to our eyes by the azure tint it imparts to us, there came to me in this case a melody which the air had strained, and which had conversed with every leaf and needle of the wood. What that portion of the sound which the elements had taken up and modulated and echoed from vale to vale, the echo is, to some extent, an original sound, and therein is the magic and charm of it. It is not merely a repetition of what was worth repeating in the bell, but partly the voice of the wood, the same trivial words and notes sung by a wood nymph. At evening, the distant lowing of some cow in the horizon beyond the woods sounded sweet and melodious, and at first I would mistake it for the voices of certain minstrels by whom I was sometimes serenaded, who might be straying over hill and dale, but soon I was not unpleasantly disappointed when it was prolonged into the cheap and natural music of the cow. I did not mean to be satirical, but to express my appreciation of these youths singing, when I state that I perceived clearly that it was akin to the music of the cow, and they were at length one articulation of nature. Regularly, at 7:30, in one part of the summer, after the evening train had gone by, the whippoorwills chanted their vespers for half an hour, sitting on a stump by my door, or upon the ridge-pole of the house. They would begin to sing almost with as much precision as a clock, within 5 minutes of a particular time, referred to the setting of the sun, every evening. I had a rare opportunity to become acquainted with their habits. Sometimes I heard 4 or 5 at once in different parts of the wood. By accident, one a bar behind the other, and so near me that I distinguished not only the cluck after each note, but often that singular buzzing sound like a fly in a spider's web, only proportionally louder. Sometimes one would circle round and round me in the woods, a few feet distant, as if tethered by a string, when probably I was near its eggs. They sang at intervals throughout the night, and were again as musical as ever just before and about dawn. When other birds are still, the screech owls take up the strain, like mourning women their ancient ululu. Their dismal scream is truly Ben Jonsonian. Wise midnight hags, it is no honest and blunt two-wit-two who of the poets, but without jesting, a most solemn graveyard ditty. The mutual consolations of suicide lovers, resembling the pangs and the delights of supernal love in the infernal groves. Yet I love to hear their wailing, their doleful responses, trilled along the woodside, reminding me sometimes of music and singing birds as if it were the dark and tearful side of music, the regrets and sighs that would fain be sung. They are the spirits, the low spirits, and the melancholy forebodings of fallen souls that once in human shape night walked the earth and did the deeds of darkness, now expiating their sins with their wailing hymns or threnodies in the scenery of their transgressions. They give me a new sense of variety and capacity of that nature which is our common dwelling. Oh, that I have never been born, sighs one on the side of the pond, and circles with the restlessness of despair to some new perch on the gray oaks. Then, that I had never been born, echoes another to the farther side, with tremulous sincerity, and born comes faintly from far in the Lincoln woods. I was also serenaded by a hooting owl. Near at hand, you could fancy it the most melancholy sound in nature, as if she meant by this to stereotype and make permanent in her choir the dying moans of a human being, some poor, weak relic of mortality who is left behind to hope, and howls like an animal, yet with human sobs, on entering the dark valley made more awful by a certain gurgling melodiousness. I find myself beginning with the letters GL when I try to imitate it. Expressive of a mind which had reached the gelatinous, mildewy stage in the mortification of all healthy and courageous thought. It reminded me of the ghouls and idiots and insane howlings, but now one answers from far woods in a strain made really melodious by distance. Hoo hoo hoo, hoo hoo. And indeed, for the most part it suggested only pleasing associations, whether heard by day or night, summer or winter. I rejoice that there are owls. Let them do the idiotic and maniacal hooting for men. It is a sound admirably suited to swamps and twilight woods which no day illustrates, suggesting a vast and underdeveloped nature which men have not recognized. They represent the stark twilight and unsatisfied thoughts which all have. All day the sun has shone on the surface of some savage swamp, where the single spruce stands hung under unseen lichens, and small hawks circulate above, and the chickadee lisps amid the evergreens, and the partridge and rabbit skulk beneath. But now a more dismal and fitting day dawns, and a different race of creatures awakes to express the meaning of nature there. Late in the evening, I heard the distant rumbling of wagons over bridges, a sound heard farther than almost any other at night, the baying of dogs, and sometimes, again, the lowing of some disconsolate cow in a distant barnyard. In the meanwhile, all the shore rang with the trump of bullfrogs, the steady spirits of ancient wine-bibbers and wassailers, still unrepentant, trying to sing a catch in their Stygian lake. Yet the Walden nymphs will pardon the comparison, for though there are almost no weeds, there are frogs there, who would fain keep up with the hilarious rules of their old festal tables, though their voices have waxed hoarse and solemnly grave, mocking at mirth, and the wine has lost its flavor, and become only liquor to distend their paunches. And sweet intoxication never comes to drown the memory of the past, but mere saturation and waterloggedness and distension. The most aldermanic, with his chin upon a heart leaf, which serves for a napkin to his drooling chaps, under this northern shore quaffs a deep draught of the once scorned water, and passes round the cup with the ejaculation, "Tronk, tronk, tronk," and straightway comes over the water from some distant cove the same password repeated, where the next in seniority and girth is gulped down to his mark, and when this observance has made the circuit of the shores, then ejaculates the master of ceremonies with satisfaction, "Tronk," and each in his turn repeats the same down to the last distended, leakiest and flabbiest paunched, that there be no mistake. And then the bowl goes round again and again, until the sun disperses the morning mist, and only the patriarch is not under the pond, but vainly bellowing "Tronk" from time to time, and pausing for a reply. I am not sure that I ever heard the sound of cock crowing from my clearing, and I thought that it might be worth the while to keep a cockerel for his music merely as a singing bird. The note of this once wild Indian pheasant is certainly the most remarkable of any birds, and if they could be naturalized without being domesticated, it would soon become the most famous sound in our woods, surpassing the clangor of the grouse, of the goose, and the hooting of the owl. And then imagine the cackling of the hens to fill the pauses when their lord's clarions rested. No wonder that man added this bird to his tame stock, to say nothing of the eggs and drumsticks. To walk in a winter morning in a wood where these birds abounded, their native woods, and hear the wild cockerels crow on the trees, clear and shrill for miles over the resounding earth, drowning the feebler notes of other birds. Think of it. It would put nations on the alert. Who would not be early to rise, and rise earlier and earlier every successive day of his life till he became unspeakably healthy, wealthy, and wise? This foreign bird's note is celebrated by the poets of all countries, along with the notes of their native songsters. All climates agree with brave Chanticleer. He is more indigenous even than the natives. His health is ever good, his lungs are sound, his spirits never flag. Even the sailor on the Atlantic and Pacific is awakened by his voice. But its shrill sound never roused me from my slumbers. I kept neither dog, cat, cow, pig, nor hens, so that you would have said there was a deficiency of domestic sounds. Neither the churn, nor the spinning wheel, nor even the singing of the kettle, nor the hissing of the urn, nor children crying to comfort one. An old-fashioned man would have lost his senses, or died of ennui before this. Not even rats in the wall, for they were starved out, or rather, were never baited in. Only squirrels on the roof or under the floor, or whippoorwill on the ridgepole, a blue jay screaming beneath the window, a hare or woodchuck under the house, a screech owl or a cat owl behind it, a flock of wild geese or a laughing loon on the pond, and a fox to bark in the night. Not even a lark or an oriole, those mild plantation birds, ever visited my clearing. No cockerels to crow, nor hens to cackle in the yard. No yard, but unfenced nature, reaching up to your very sills. A young forest growing up under your meadows, and wild sumacs and blackberry vines breaking through into your cellar. Sturdy pitch pines rubbing and creaking against the shingles for want of room, their roots reaching quite under the house. Instead of a scuttle or a blind blown off in the gale, a pine tree snapped off or torn by the roots behind your house for fuel. Instead of no path to the front yard gate in the great snow, no gate, no front yard, and no path to the civilized world. That's the end of the section on sounds. And he does go over quite a few different sounds in that. So he was talking about the man-made sounds that were nearby, the people coming to and fro, the railroad, and the trains going on their appointed times and schedules, the people around the rails that kind of brought it hustle and bustle in life, but then shifted into the natural sounds, sort of the inspiration of the BGM we've got running now. It's meant to be sort of the natural hubbub and bustle of just everything going on around. It is pretty nice to just like take a walk in the park and just sit on a bench and close your eyes, just to hear what's around. Sometimes it's the burbling of a pond, the creek just babbling as it goes along its path, occasional splash from a fish coming up to snag a bug. You hear the birds rustling in the bushes, squirrels that are chittering and generally making asses of themselves because squirrels always seem to. So it's nice to get lost in sounds like this. I can, for once, actually agree with Thoreau. It's all kind of nice. He does definitely sound like a D&D player who picks up Druid for the first time, though. Trying to dial it all up to 11. Go all in on it. Alright, let's go over to the next chapter here. And we have Solitude. This is a delicious evening, when the whole body is one sense, and imbibes delight through every pore. I go and come with strange liberty in nature, a part of herself, as I walk along the stony shore of the pond in my shirt sleeves. Though it is cool as well as cloudy and windy, and I see nothing special to attract me. All the elements are unusually congenial to me. The bullfrogs trump to usher in the night, and the note of the whippoorwill is borne on the rippling wind from over the water. Sympathy with the fluttering alder and poplar leaves almost takes away my breath. Yet, like the lake, my serenity is rippled, but not ruffled. These small waves, raised by the evening wind, are as remote from the storm as the smooth reflecting surface. Though it is now dark, the wind still blows and roars in the wood, and the waves still dash, and some creatures lull the rest with their notes. The repose is never complete. The wildest animals do not repose, but seek their prey now. The fox and the skunk and the rabbit now roam the fields and woods without fear. They are nature's watchmen, links which connect the days of animated life. When I return to my house, I find that visitors have been there and left their cards, either a bunch of flowers or a wreath of evergreen or a name in pencil on a yellow walnut leaf or a chip. Those who come rarely to the woods take some little piece of the forest into their hands to play with, by the way, which they leave, either intentionally or accidentally. One has peeled a willow wand, woven it into a ring, and dropped it on my table. I could always tell if visitors had called in my absence, either by the bended twigs or grass, or the print of their shoes, and generally of what sex or age or quality they were by some slight trace left, as a flower dropped, or a bunch of grass plucked and thrown away, even as far off as the railroad, half a mile distant, or by the lingering odor of a cigar or a pipe. Nay, I was frequently notified by the passage of a traveler along the highway 60 rods off by the scent of his pipe. There is commonly sufficient space about us. Our horizon is never quite at our elbows. The thick wood is not just at our door, nor the pond, but somewhat is always clearing, familiar and worn by us, appropriated and fenced in some way, and reclaimed from nature. For what reason have I this vast range and circuit, some square miles of unfrequented forest, for my privacy, abandoned to me by men? My nearest neighbor is a mile distant, and no house is visible from any place but the hilltops within half a mile of my own. I have my horizon bounded by woods all to myself, a distant view of the railroad, where it touches the pond on the one hand, and of the fence, which skirts the woodland road on the other. But for the most part, it is as solitary where I live as on the prairies. It is as much Asia or Africa as New England. I have, as it were, my own sun and moon and stars, and a little world all to myself. At night there was never a traveler passed my house, or knocked at my door more than if I were the first or last man, unless it were in the spring, when at long intervals some came from the village to fish for pouts. They plainly fished much more in the Walden pond of their own natures, and baited their hooks with darkness, but they soon retreated, usually with light baskets, and left the world to darkness and to me. And the black kernel of the night was never profaned by any human neighborhood. I believe that men are generally still a little afraid of the dark, though the witches are all hung in Christianity and candles have been introduced. Yet I experienced sometimes that the most sweet and tender, the most innocent and encouraging society may be found in any natural object, even for the poor misanthrope and most melancholy man. There can be no very black melancholy to him who lives in the midst of nature and has his senses still. There was never yet such a storm but when it was aeolian music, to a healthy and innocent ear. Nothing can rightly compel a simple and brave man to a vulgar sadness. While I enjoy the friendship of the seasons, I trust that nothing can make life a burden to me. The gentle rain which waters my beans and keeps me in the house today is not drear and melancholy, but good for me too. Though it prevents my hoeing them, it is far more worth than my hoeing. If it should continue so long as to cause the seeds to rot in the ground and destroy the potatoes in the lowlands, it would still be good for the grass on the uplands. And being good for the grass, it would be good for me. Sometimes, when I compare myself with other men, it seems as if I were more favored by the gods than they, beyond any deserts which I am conscious of, as if I had a warrant and surety at their hands, which my fellows have not, and were especially guided and guarded. I do not flatter myself, but if it be possible, they flatter me. I have never felt lonesome, or in the least oppressed by a sense of solitude, but once. And that was a few weeks after I came to the woods, when, for an hour, I doubted if the near neighborhood of man was not essential to a serene and healthy life. To be alone was something unpleasant, but I was at the same time conscious of a slight insanity in my mood, and seemed to foresee my recovery. In the midst of a gentle rain, while these thoughts prevailed, I was suddenly sensible of such sweet and beneficent society in nature, in the very pattering of the drops, and in every sound and sight around my house, an infinite and unaccountable friendliness all at once like an atmosphere sustaining me, as made the fancied advantages of human neighborhood insignificant, and I have never thought of them since. Every little pine needle expanded and swelled with sympathy and befriended me. I was so distinctly made aware of the presence of something kindred to me, even in scenes which we are accustomed to call wild and dreary, and also that the nearest of blood to me and humanest was not a person nor a villager, that I thought no place could ever be strange to me again. Mourning untimely consumes the sad. Few are their days in the land of the living, brighter and beautiful daughter of Toscar. Some of my pleasantest hours were during the long rainstorms in the spring or fall, which confined me to the house for the afternoon as well as the forenoon, soothed by their ceaseless roaring pelting, when an early twilight ushered in a long evening in which many thoughts had time to take root and unfold themselves. And those driving northeast rains which tried the village houses so, when the maid stood ready with mop and pail in front entries to keep the deluge out, I sat behind my door in my little house, which was all entry, and thoroughly enjoyed its protection. In one heavy thunder shower, the lightning struck a large pitch pine across the pond, making a very conspicuous and perfectly regular spiral grove from top to bottom, an inch or more deep and 4 or 5 inches wide, and as you would groove a walking stick. I passed it again the other day and was struck with awe on looking up and beholding that mark, now more distinct than ever, where a terrific and resistless bolt came down out of the harmless sky 8 years ago. Men frequently say to me, I should think you would feel lonesome down there, and want to be nearer to folks, rainy and snowy days and nights especially. I am tempted to reply to such. This whole earth which we inhabit is but a point in space. How far apart, think you, dwell the two most distant inhabitants of yonder star, the breadth of whose disk cannot be appreciated by our instruments? Why should I feel lonely? Is not our planet in the Milky Way? This, which you put, seems to me not to be the most important question. What sort of space is that which separates a man from his fellows and makes him solitary? I have found that no exertion of the legs can bring two minds much nearer to one another. What do we want most to dwell near to? Not to many men, surely. The depot, the post office, the bar room, the meeting house, the schoolhouse, the grocery, Beacon Hill, or the 5 Points, where men must most congregate, but to the perennial source of our life, whence in all our experience we have found that to issue, as the willow stands near the water and sends out its roots in that direction. This will vary with different natures, but this is the place where a wise man will dig his cellar. I one evening overtook one of my townsmen, who was accumulating what is called a handsome property, though I never got a fair view of it, on the Walden road, driving a pair of cattle to market, who inquired of me how I could bring my mind to give up so many of the comforts of life. I answered that I was very sure I liked it passably well. I was not joking, and so I went home to my bed, and left him to pick his way through the darkness and the mud to Brighton, or Brighttown, which place he would reach some time in the morning. Any prospect of awakening or coming to life to a dead man makes indifferent all times and places. The place where that may occur is always the same, and indescribably pleasant to all our senses. For the most part, we allow only outlying and transient circumstances to make our occasions. They are, in fact, the cause of our distraction. Nearest to all things is that power which fashions their being. Next to us, the grandest laws are continually being executed. Next to us is not the workman whom we have hired, with whom we love so well to talk, but the workman whose work we are. How vast and profound is the influence of the subtleties, power, the subtile power of heaven and earth. We seek to perceive them, and we do not see them. We seek to hear them, and we do not hear them. Identified with the substance of things, they cannot be separated from them. They cause that in all the universe men purify and sanctify their hearts, and clothe themselves in their holiday garments to offer sacrifices and oblations to their ancestors. It is an ocean of subtile intelligences. They are everywhere, above us, on our left, on our right. They environ us on all sides. We are the subjects of an experiment, which is not a little interesting to me. Can we not do without the society of our gossips a little while under these circumstances? Have our own thoughts to cheer us? Confucius says truly, virtue does not remain as an abandoned orphan. It must of necessity have neighbors. With thinking we may be beside ourselves in a sane sense. By a conscious effort of the mind, we can stand aloof from actions and their consequences, and all things, good and bad, go by us like a torrent. We are not wholly involved in nature. I may be either the driftwood in the stream or Indra in the sky looking down on it. I may be affected by a theatrical exhibition. On the other hand, I may not be affected by an actual event, which appears to concern me much more. I only know myself as a human entity, the scene, so to speak, of thoughts and affections. I am sensible of certain doubleness, by which I can stand as remote from myself as from another. However intense my experience, I am conscious of the presence and criticism of a part of me, which, as it were, is not a part of me, but spectator, sharing no experience, but taking note of it. And that is no more I than it is you. When the play, it may be the tragedy of life, is over, the spectator goes his way. It was a kind of fiction, a work of the imagination only, so far as he was concerned. This doubleness may easily make us poor neighbors and friends sometimes. I find it wholesome to be alone the greater part of the time. To be in company, even with the best, is soon wearisome and dissipating. I love to be alone. I never found the companion that was so companionable as solitude. We are for the most part more lonely when we go abroad among men than when we stay in our chambers. A man thinking of working is always alone. Let him be where he will. Solitude is not measured by the miles of space that intervene between a man and his fellows. The really diligent student in one of the crowded hives of Cambridge College is as solitary as a dervish in the desert. The farmer can work alone in the field or the woods all day, hoeing or chopping, and not feel lonesome, because he is employed. But when he comes home at night, he cannot sit down in a room alone, at the mercy of his thoughts, but must be where he can see the folks, and recreate, and as he thinks remunerate himself for his day's solitude. And hence he wonders how the student can sit alone in the house all night and most of the day without ennui and the blues. But he does not realize that the student, though in the house, is still at work in his field and chopping in his woods as the farmer in his, and in turn seeks the same recreation and society that the latter does, though it may be a more condensed form of it. Society is commonly too cheap. We meet at very short intervals, not having had time to acquire any new value for each other. We meet at meals 3 times a day, and give each other a new taste of that old musty cheese that we are. We have had to agree on a certain set of rules, called etiquette and politeness, to make this frequent meeting tolerable, and that we need not come to open war. We meet at the post office, and at the sociable, and about the fireside every night, and we live thick and are in each other's way and stumble over one another, and I think that we thus lose some respect for one another. Certainly, less frequency would suffice for all important and hearty communications. Consider the girls in a factory, never alone, hardly in their dreams. It would be better if there were but one inhabitant to a square mile, as where I live. The value of a man is not in his skin, that we should touch him. I have heard of a man lost in the woods and dying of famine and exhaustion at the foot of a tree, whose loneliness was relieved by the grotesque visions with which, owing to bodily weakness, his diseased imagination surrounded him, and which he believed to be real. So also, owing to bodily and mental health and strength, we may be continually cheered by a like, but more normal and natural society, and come to know that we are never alone. I have a great deal of company in my house, especially in the morning, when nobody calls. Let me suggest a few comparisons, that someone may convey an idea of my situation. I am no more lonely than the loon in the pond that laughs so loud. or than Walden Pond itself. What company has that lonely lake, I pray? And yet it has not the blue devils, but the blue angels in it, in the azure tint of its waters. The sun is alone, except in the thick weather where there sometimes appear to be two, but one is a mock sun. God is alone, but the devil, he is far from being alone. He sees a great deal of company. He is legion. I am no more lonely than a single mullein, or dandelion in a pasture, or a bean leaf, or a sorrel, or a horsefly, or a bumblebee. I am no more lonely than the millbrook, or a weathercock, or the north star, or the south wind, or an April shower, or a January thaw, or the first spider in a new house. I have occasional visits in the long winter evenings, when the snow falls fast and the wind howls in the wood, from an old settler and original proprietor, who is reported to have dug Walden Pond and stoned it, and fringed it with pine woods, and who tells me stories of old time and new eternity. Between us, we manage to pass a cheerful evening with social mirth and pleasant views of things, even without apples or cider. A most wise and humorous friend whom I love much, who keeps himself more secret than ever did Goff or Wallen. And though he is thought to be dead, none can show where he is buried. An elderly dame, too, dwells in my neighborhood, invisible to most persons, in whose odorous herb garden I love to stroll sometimes, gathering simples and listening to her fables, for she has a genius of unequaled fertility, and her memory runs back farther than mythology, and she can tell me the original of every fable, and on what fact every one is founded. For the incidents occurred when she was young, a ruddy and lusty old dame who delights in all weathers and seasons, and is likely to outlive all her children yet. The indescribable innocence and beneficence of nature, of sun and wind and rain, of summer and winter, such health, such cheer they afford forever, and such sympathy they ever with our race, that all nature would be affected, and the sun's brightness fade, and the winds would sigh humanely, and the clouds rain tears, and the woods shed their leaves and put on mourning in midsummer, if any man should ever for a just cause grieve. Shall I not have intelligence with the earth? Am I not partly leaves and vegetable mold myself? What is the pill? It may very well have been man-made, or at least sustained. A lot of times you have to put retaining stone into some ponds when they were just to make sure they stick around. But also, it kind of seems as if it was sort of Mother Nature and Father Time sort of allegory there, because it's the talking about people that were way outside of their time. So I think that was probably trying to be allegorical. It's Thoreau, though. It very well could have been someone that actually put in stones to lay the pond. Where was I? What is the pill which will keep us well, serene, contented? Not my or thy great-grandfathers, but our great-grandmother, nature's universal, vegetable, botanic medicines, by which she has kept herself young always, outlived so many old pars in her day, and fed her health with their decaying fatness. For my panacea, instead of one of those quack vials of a mixture dipped from Acheron and the Dead Sea, which come out of those long, shallow, black schooner-looking wagons which we sometimes see made to carry bottles, let me have a draught of undiluted morning air. Morning air! If men will not drink of this at the fountainhead of the day, why, then, we must even bottle up some and sell it in the shops, for the benefit of those who have lost their subscription ticket to morning time in this world. But remember, it will not keep quite till noonday, even in the coolest cellar. But drive out the stopples long ere that, and follow westward the steps of Aurora. I am no worshipper of Hygeia, who was the daughter of that old herb collector Asclepius, and who is represented on monuments holding a serpent in one hand, and in the other a cup out of which the serpent sometimes drinks, but rather of Hebe, cupbearer to Jupiter, who is the daughter of Juno and wild lettuce, and who had the power of restoring gods and men to the vigor of youth. She was probably the only thoroughly sound-conditioned, healthy, and robust young lady that ever walked the globe, and wherever she came, it was spring. That brings us to the end of that section on solitude. this is another section that I find myself having difficulty to really disagree with a lot of what he was saying. It's nice sometimes to just be alone. There are days where, well, fewer days these days than there used to be, but there were days where I would go entire days of saying maybe 2 words, and just being comfortable with myself and the cats. Now I find myself talking incessantly, but that's the life I've chosen, right? But yeah, it's sometimes nice to just be alone with your thoughts. And by that same token, though, you can have that same sort of sense of solitude even in a crowd if you just find your own solitude in your mind. Those are that's all very introvert coded. So I recharge my batteries by being alone. Thank you very much. Alright, I am going to step aside for a little bit. Mr. Simba is acting a little funny. I'm going to make sure he's feeling okay. And then we're going to take a quick break, and we will be back in just a little while. So, go ahead. Top up your drinks and stretch your legs. We'll be back in just a little while. Thanks, guys. Okay, we are back. Let's get settled in. And shift back over and let's update this. Because it is past dark, so let's have an appropriate drink for the evening. Alright. I think poor Mr. Simba's got a cold. Threw up a little bit earlier and is not feeling too happy. He just kind of sits in his bed and does his thing. So we'll keep an eye on him for the next day or two and see if he bounces back. Between growing pains and all that, he's just a little man, so he's growing a lot these days. So between that and the cold, the spring cold, probably just having a little bit too much for him right now. But we'll keep an eye on him. Alright, so let's go ahead and get back to our reading, and we will see where Thoreau takes us next. Yeah, I'm not too worried about it as long as he bounces back within a day or two, it should be alright. I mean, I had the same thing when I was he's effectively a teenager right now. You grow a lot when you're that size. So just a little achy and painy. So make sure he's comfy and go from there. Yeah, this is the first time I've seen him do it, so it may just be first cold of his little life. It happens. So just keep an eye on him, make sure nothing goes sideways, and call up the vet on Monday if it gets to that. Not too worried yet. This isn't the first rodeo. Alright, so let's get back into it then. We've got a little bit less than an hour left, and we'll probably get through another section, maybe two, depending on the night. We're about 38% of the way through the book, so this is definitely going to be one of our longer ones, but they're, it's just so darn dense. Oh, lordy. Alright, so the next chapter is Visitors, which in contrast to the previous one being Solitude, we'll kind of see what he has an idea for. I think that I love society about as much as most, and I'm ready enough to fasten myself like a bloodsucker for the time to any full-blooded man that comes in my way. I am naturally no hermit, but might possibly sit out the sturdiest frequenter of the barroom, if my business called me thither. I had 3 chairs in my house, 1 for solitude, 2 for friendship, 3 for society. When visitors came in larger and unexpected numbers, there was but the 3rd chair for them all, but they generally economized the room by standing up. It is surprising how many great men and women a small house will contain. I've had 25 or 30 souls with their bodies at once under my roof, and yet we often parted without being aware that we had come very near to one another. Many of our houses, both public and private, with their almost innumerable apartments, their huge halls and their cellars for the storage of wines and their other munitions of peace, appear to me extravagantly large for their inhabitants. They are so vast and magnificent that the latter seem to be only vermin which infest them. I am surprised when the herald blows his summons before some Tremont or Astor or Middlesex house to see it come creeping out over the piazza for all inhabitants a ridiculous mouse, which soon again slinks into some hole in the pavement. One inconvenience I sometimes experienced in so small a house: the difficulty of getting to a sufficient distance from my guest when we began to utter the big thoughts and big words. You want room for your thoughts to get into sailing trim and run a course or two before they make their port. The bullet of your thought must have overcome its lateral and ricochet motion and fallen into its last and steady course before it reaches the ear of the hearer. Else it may plow out again through the side of his head. Also, our sentences wanted room to unfold and form their columns in the interval. Individuals, like nations, must have suitable broad and natural boundaries, even a considerable neutral ground between them. I found it a singular luxury to talk across the pond to a companion on the opposite side. In my house we were so near that we could not begin to hear. We could not speak low enough to be heard, as when you throw 2 stones into calm water so near that they break each other's undulations. We are merely loquacious and loud talkers. Then we can afford to stand very near each other, cheek by jowl, and feel each other's breath. But if we speak reservedly and thoughtfully, we want to be further apart, that all animal heat and moisture may have a chance to evaporate. And if we would enjoy the most intimate society, with that in each of us, which is without or above being spoken to, we must not only be silent, but commonly so. So far apart, bodily, that we cannot possibly hear each other's voice in any case. Referred to this standard, speech is for the convenience of those who are hard of hearing, but there are many fine things which we cannot say if we have to shout. As the conversation began to assume a loftier and grander tone, we gradually shoved our chairs farther apart till they touched the wall in opposite corners, and then, commonly, there was not room enough. My best room, however, my withdrawing room, always ready for company, on whose carpet the sun rarely fell, was the pine wood behind my house. Thither, in summer days, when distinguished guests came, I took them, and a priceless domestic swept the floor and dusted the furniture and kept the things in order. If one guest came, he sometimes partook of my frugal meal, and it was no interruption to conversation to be stirring a hasty pudding or watching the rising and maturing of a loaf of bread in the ashes. In the meanwhile, but if 20 came and sat in my house, there was nothing said about dinner, though there might be bread enough for two, more than if eating were a forsaken habit. But we naturally practiced abstinence, and this was never felt to be an offense against hospitality, but the most proper and considerate course. The waste and decay of physical life, which so often needs repair, seemed miraculously retarded in such a case, and the vital vigor stood its ground. I could entertain thus 1,000 as well as 20, and if ever went away disappointed or hungry from my house, when they found me at home, they may depend upon it that I sympathized with them at least. So easy it is, though many housekeepers doubt it, to establish new and better customs in the place of the old. You need not rest your reputation on the dinners you give. For my own part, I was never so effectually deterred from frequenting a man's house, by any kind of Cerberus whatever, as by the parade one made about dining me, which I took to be a very polite and roundabout hint to never trouble him so again. I think I shall never revisit those scenes. I should be proud to have for my motto of my cabin those lines of Spenser which one of my visitors inscribed on a yellow walnut leaf for a card. Arrived there, the little house they fill. Ne looked for entertainment where none was. Rest is their feast, and all things at their will. The noblest mind the best contentment has. When Winslow, afterward governor of Plymouth Colony, went with a companion on a visit of ceremony to Massasoit on foot through the woods, and arrived tired and hungry at his lodge, they were well received by the king, but nothing was said about eating that day. When the night arrived, to quote their own words, he laid us on the bed with himself and his wife, they at the one end and we at the other, it being only planks laid a foot from the ground, and a thin mat upon them. 2 more of his chief men, for want of room, pressed by and upon us, so that we were worse weary of our lodging than of our journey. At 1 o'clock the next day, Massasoit brought 2 fishes that he had shot, and about thrice as big as a bream. These being boiled, there were at least 40 looked for a share in them. The most 8 of them. This meal only we had in 2 nights and a day, and had not one of us bought a partridge. We had taken our journey fasting, fearing that they would be light-headed for want of food, and also sleep, owing to the savages' barbarous singing, for they used to sing themselves to sleep, and that they might get home while they had strength to travel, they departed. As for lodging, it is true they were but poorly entertained, though what they found an inconvenience was no doubt intended for an honor. As far as eating was concerned, I do not see how the Indians could have done better. They had nothing to eat themselves, and they were wiser than to think that apologies could supply the place of food to their guests. So they drew their belts tighter and said nothing about it. Another time, when Winslow visited them, it being a season of plenty with them, there was no deficiency in this respect. As for men, they will hardly fail anyone where. I had more visitors while I lived in the woods than at any other period in my life. I mean that I had some. I met several there under more favorable circumstances than I could anywhere else, but fewer came to see me on trivial business. In this respect, my company was winnowed by mere distance from town. I had withdrawn so far within the great ocean of solitude into which the rivers of society empty, that for the most part, so far as my needs were concerned, only the finest sediment was deposited around me. Beside, there were wafted to me evidences of unexplored and uncultivated continents on the other side. Who should come to my lodge this morning but a true Homeric, or Paphlagonian man? He had so suitable and poetic a name that I am sorry I cannot print it here. A Canadian, a woodchopper and postmaker, who can hole 50 posts in a day, who made his last supper on a woodchuck which his dog caught. He, too, had heard of Homer, and, if it were not for books, would not know what to do rainy days. Though perhaps he was not read one wholly through for many rainy seasons. Some priest who could pronounce the Greek itself taught him to read his verse in the Testament in his native parish far away, and now I must translate to him, while he holds the book Achilles' reproof to Patroclus for his sad countenance. Why are you in tears, Patroclus, like a young girl? Or have you heard some news from Phthia? They say that Menicius still lives yet, son of Actor, and Peleus lives, son of Asius, among the Myrmidons, either of whom, having died, we should greatly grieve. He says, that's good, and he had a great bundle of white oak bark under his arm for a sick man, gathered as Sunday morning. I suppose there's no harm in going after such a thing today, says he. To him, Homer was a great writer, though what his writing was about he did not know. A more simple and natural man it would be hard to find. Vice and disease, which cast such a somber moral hue over the world, seemed to have hardly any existence for him. He was about 28 years old, and had left Canada and his father's house a dozen years before to work in the States, and earn money to buy a farm with, at last, perhaps in his native country, he was cast in the coarsest mold. A stout but sluggish boy, yet gracefully carried, with a thick sunburnt neck, dark bushy hair, and dull sleepy blue eyes, which were occasionally lit up with expression. He wore a flat gray cloth cap, a dingy wool-colored greatcoat, and cowhide boots. He was a great consumer of meat, usually carrying his dinner to his work a couple of miles past my house, for he chopped all summer, in a tin pail, cold beans, often cold woodchucks, and coffee in a stone bottle, which dangled by a string from his belt. And sometimes he offered me a drink. He came along early, crossing my bean field, though without anxiety or haste to get to his work, such as Yankees exhibit. He wasn't going to hurt himself. He didn't care if he only earned his board. Frequently, he would leave his dinner in the bushes, when his dog had caught a woodchuck by the way, and go back a mile and a half to dress it, and leave it in the cellar of the house where he boarded, after deliberating first for half an hour whether he could not sink it in the pond safely till nightfall, loving to dwell long upon these themes. He would say, as he went by in the morning, how thick the pigeons are. If working every day were not my trade, I could get all the meat I should want by hunting. Pigeons, woodchucks, rabbits, partridges, my gosh! I could get all I should want for a week in one day. He was a skillful chopper, and indulged in some flourishes and ornaments in his art. He cut his trees level and close to the ground, that the sprouts which came up afterward might be more vigorous, and a sled might slide over the stumps. And instead of leaving a whole tree to support his corded wood, he would pare it away to a slender stake or splinter, which you could break off with your hand at last. He interested me because he was so quiet and solitary and so happy withal, a well of good humor and contentment which overflowed at his eyes. His mirth was without alloy. Sometimes I saw him at his work in the woods, felling trees, and he would greet me with a laugh of inexpressible satisfaction, and a salutation in Canadian French, though he spoke English as well. When I approached him, he would suspend his work, and with half-suppressed mirth lie along the trunk of a pine which he had felled, and peeling off the inner bark, roll it up into a ball and chew it, while he laughed and talked. Such an exuberance of animal spirits had he, that he sometimes tumbled down and rolled on the ground with laughter at anything which made him think and tickled him. Looking round upon the trees, he would exclaim, "By George! I can enjoy myself well enough here, chopping. I want no better sport." Sometimes, when at leisure, he amused himself all day in the woods with a pocket pistol, firing salutes to himself at regular intervals as he walked. In the winter, he had a fire by which at noon he warmed his coffee in a kettle, and as he sat on a log to eat his dinner, the chickadees would sometimes come round and alight on his arm and peck at the potato in his fingers, and he said that he liked to have the little fellers about him. In him, the animal man chiefly was developed. In physical endurance and contentment, he was cousin to the pine and the rock. I asked him once if he was not sometimes tired at night after working all day, and he answered with a sincere and serious look, "Grappet, I was never tired in my life." But the intellectual, and what is called spiritual man in him were slumbering as in an infant. He had been instructed only in that innocent and ineffectual way in which the Catholic priests teach the Aborigines, by which the pupil is never educated to the degree of consciousness, but only to the degree of trust and reverence. And a child is not made a man, but kept a child. When nature made him, she gave him a strong body and contentment for his portion. She propped him on every side with reverence and reliance, that he might live out his 80 years and 10 a child. He was so genuine and unsophisticated that no introduction would serve to introduce him, more than if you introduced a woodchuck to your neighbor. He had got to find out as you did. He would not play any part. Men paid him wages for work, and so he helped to feed and clothe them. But he never exchanged opinions with them. He was so simply and naturally humble, if he can be called humble who never aspires, that humility was no distinct quality in him, nor could he conceive of it. Wiser men were demigods to him. If you told him that such a one was coming, he did as if he thought that anything so grand would expect nothing of himself, but take all the responsibility on itself, and let him be forgotten still. He never heard the sound of praise. He particularly reverenced the writer and the preacher. Their performances were miracles. When I told him that I wrote considerably, he thought for a long time that it was merely the handwriting which I meant, for he could write a remarkably good hand himself. I sometimes found the name of his native parish handsomely written in the snow by the highway, with the proper French accent, and knew that he had passed. I asked him if he ever wished to write his thoughts. He said that he had read and written letters for those who could not, but he never tried to write thoughts. No, he could not. He could not tell what to put first. It would kill him. And then there was spelling to be attended to at the same time. I heard that a distinguished wise man and reformer asked him if he did not want the world to be changed, but he answered with a chuckle of surprise in his Canadian accent, not knowing that the question had ever been entertained before. "No, I like it well enough." It would have suggested many things to a philosopher to have dealings with him. To a stranger he appeared to know nothing of things in general, yet I sometimes saw in him a man whom I had not seen before, and I did not know whether he was as wise as Shakespeare or as simply ignorant as a child, whether to suspect him of a fine poetic consciousness or of stupidity. A townsman told me that he had met him sauntering through the village in his small, close-fitting cap and whistling to himself. He reminded him of a prince in disguise. His only books were an almanac and an arithmetic, in which last he was considerably expert. The former was a sort of cyclopedia to him, which he supposed to contain an abstract of human knowledge, as indeed it does to a considerable extent. I loved to sound him on the various reforms of the day, and he could never fail to look at them in the most simple and practical light. He had never heard of such things before. Could he do without factories? I asked. He had worn the homemade Vermont gray, he said, and that was good. Could he dispense with tea and coffee? Did this country afford any beverage beside water? He had soaked hemlock leaves in water and drank it, and thought that was better than water in warm weather. When I asked him if he could do without money, he showed the convenience of money in such a way as to suggest and coincide with the most philosophical accounts of the origin of this institution, and the very derivation of the word pecunia. If an ox were his property, and he wished to get needles and thread at the store, he thought it would be inconvenient and impossible soon to go on mortgaging some portion of the creature each time to that amount. He could defend many institutions better than any philosopher, because, in describing them as they concerned him, he gave the true reason for their prevalence, and speculation had not suggested to him any other. And at another time, hearing Plato's definition of a man, a biped without feathers, and that one exhibited a cock plucked and called it Plato's man, he thought it an important difference that the knees bent the wrong way. He would sometimes exclaim, "How I love to talk! By George, I could talk all day!" I asked him once, when I had not seen him for many months, if he had got a new idea this summer. "Good Lord," said he, "a man that has to work as I do, if he does not forget the ideas he has had, he will do well. Maybe the man you hoe with is inclined to race. Then, by Gary, your mind must be there. You think of weeds." He would sometimes ask me first on such occasions if I had made any improvement. One winter day I asked him if he was always satisfied with himself, wishing to suggest a substitute within him for the priest without, and some higher motive for living. "Satisfied," said he. "Some men are satisfied with one thing, and some with another. One man, perhaps, if he has got enough, will be satisfied to sit all day with his back to the fire and his belly to the table, by George." Yet I never, by any maneuvering, could get him to take the spiritual view of things. The highest that he appeared to conceive of was of a simple expediency, such as you might expect an animal to appreciate. And with this, practically, is true of all men, of most men. If I suggested any improvement in his mode of life, he merely answered, without expressing any regret, that it was too late. Yet he thoroughly believed in honesty and the like virtues. There was a certain positive originality, however slight, to be detected in him, and I occasionally observed that he was thinking for himself and expressing his own opinion. A phenomenon so rare that I could any day walk 10 miles to observe it, and it amounted to the reorigination of many of the institutions of society. Though he hesitated and perhaps failed to express himself distinctly, he always had a presentable thought behind. Yet his thinking was so primitive and immersed within his animal life that, though more promising than a merely learned man's, it rarely ripened to anything which can be reported. He suggested that there might be men of genius in the lowest grades of life, however permanently humble and illiterate, who take their own view always, or do not pretend to see at all, who are as bottomless as even as Walden Pond was thought to be, though they may be dark and muddy. Many a traveler came out of his way to see me in the inside of my house, and, as an excuse for calling, asked for a glass of water. I told them that I drank at the pond and pointed thither, offering to lend them a dipper. Far off as I liked, I was not exempted from the annual visitation which occurs, methinks, about the 1st of April, when every body is on the move, and I had my share of good luck, though there were some curious specimens among my visitors. Half-witted men from the almshouse and elsewhere came to see me, but I endeavored to make them exercise all the wit they had, and make their confessions to me, in such cases making wit the theme of our conversations, and so was compensated. Indeed, I found some of them to be wiser than the so-called overseers of the poor and selectmen of the town, and thought it was time that the tables were turned. With respect to wit, I learned that there was not much difference between the half and the whole. One day in particular, an inoffensive, simple-minded pauper, whom with others I had often seen used as fencing stuff, standing or sitting on a bushel in the fields to keep cattle and himself from straying, visited me, and expressed a wish to live as I did. He told me with the utmost simplicity and truth, quite superior, or rather inferior, to anything that is called humility, that he was deficient in intellect. These were his words. The Lord had made him so, and yet he supposed the Lord cared as much for him as for another. "I have always been so," said he. "From my childhood, I had never had much mind. I was not like other children. I am weak in the head. It was the Lord's will, I suppose." And there he was to prove the truth of his words. He was a metaphysical puzzle to me. I have rarely met a fellow man on such promising ground. It was so simple and sincere and so true, all that he said, and yet true enough, in proportion as he appeared to humble himself, was he exalted. I did not know at first, but it was the result of a wise policy. It seemed that from such a basis of truth and frankness as the poor weak-headed pauper had laid, our intercourse might go forward to something better than the intercourse of sages. I had some guests from those not reckoned commonly among the town's poor, but who should be, who are among the world's poor, at any rate. Guests who appeal not to your hospitality, but to your hospitality, who earnestly wish to be helped, and preface their appeal with the information that they are resolved, for one thing, never to help themselves. I require of a visitor that he be not actually starving, though he may have the very best appetite in the world, however he got it. Objects of charity are not guests. Men who did not know when their visit had terminated, though I went about my business again, answering them from greater and greater remoteness. Men of almost every degree of wit called on me in the migrating season. Some who had more wits than they knew what to do with, runaway slaves with plantation manners, who listened from time to time, like the fox in the fable, as if they had heard the hounds baying on their track, and looked at me beseechingly, as much to say, "Oh, Christian, will you send me back?" One real runaway slave, among the rest, whom I helped to forward toward the North Star, men of one idea, like a hen with one chicken, and that a duckling, men of 1,000 ideas and unkempt heads, like those of hens, which are made to take charge of 100 chickens, all in pursuit of one bug, a score of them lost in every morning's dew, and become frizzled and mangy in consequence. Men of ideas instead of legs, a sort of intellectual centipede that made you crawl all over. One man proposed a book in which visitors should write their names, as at the White Mountains, but alas, I have too good a memory to make that necessary. I could not but notice some of the peculiarities of my visitors. Girls and boys and young women generally seemed glad to be in the woods. They looked in the pond and at the flowers, and improved their time. Men of business, even farmers, thought only of solitude and employment, and of the great distance at which I dwelt from something or other, and though they said they had loved to ramble in the woods occasionally, it was obvious that they did not. Restless, committed men, whose time was all taken up in getting a living and keeping it. Ministers who spoke of God as if they enjoyed a monopoly of the subject, who could not bear all kinds of opinions. Doctors, lawyers, uneasy housekeepers who pried into my cupboard in bed when I was out. How came Mrs. something or other to know that my sheets were not as clean as hers? Young men who had ceased to be young, and had concluded that it was safest to follow the beaten track of the professions. All these generally said that it was not possible to do so much good in my position. Aye, there was the rub. The old and infirm and the timid, of whatever age or sex, thought most of sickness, and sudden accident and death. To them, life seemed full of danger. What danger is there if you don't think of any? And they thought that a prudent man would carefully select the safest position, or Dr. B might be on hand at a moment's warning. To them, the village was literally a community, a league for mutual defense, and you would suppose they would not go a huckleberrying without medicine chest. The amount of it is, if a man is alive, there is always danger that he may die, and though the danger must be allowed to be less in proportion as he is dead and alive to begin with, a man sits as many risks as he runs. Finally, there were the self-styled reformers, the greatest bores of all, who thought I was forever singing, "This is the house that I built. This is the man that lives in the house that I built." But they did not know that the third line was, "These are the folks that worry the man that lives in the house that I built." I did not fear the hen harriers, for I kept no chickens, but I feared the men harriers rather. I had more cheering visitors than the last. Children come a-bearing, railroad men taking a Sunday morning walk in clean shirts, fishermen and hunters, poets and philosophers. In short, all honest pilgrims, who came out of the woods for freedom's sake, and really left the village behind. I was ready to greet with, welcome Englishmen, for I had had communication with that race. That brings us to the end of this chapter, visitors. So, he's not so much just alone in the woods all the time, and there are, understandably, those that he cares little for. The idea that the biggest thoughts take the most space is interesting. I know when things get rambunctious, you generally don't want to be in close quarters. But then how much he liked the Canadian lumberjack was kind of fun. It was the man himself thought of himself simple, but there was real thought going on, and an honest to goodness sort of salt of the earth sort of vibe that was generally good. But this whole chapter kind of slaps of him feeling superior, which, I mean, the whole book slaps of him feeling superior, so that's just sort of Thoreau. But it was nice to see that he took such stock in the regular lumberjack's way of life and enjoyed his visits as much as he did. But he's definitely much less disconnected from the world than originally you might see or be led on. Okay. 1 sec. Yeah, I could see misanthropy being a common criticism toward him. It's not necessarily completely accurate. I think it's more just, I don't know, maybe a mild misanthropist. Because it's not that he doesn't like people, he just prefers small doses, it seems. Narcissist, he's spot on a narcissist. But I could definitely see a mild case of misanthropy. But don't all of us have a little bit of a streak of that? Sometimes just you're pissed at the whole world. It happens. He just happened to put all of those incidents down on paper. Alright, we've probably got enough time to get one more chapter in. This next one's about 6 pages long, so that means it should only take about, 20-30 minutes. Throat kills me. Jeez. Alright, so the next one is The Beanfield. Yeah, I feel you. Like, I sometimes will profess that I'm misanthropic, but it's usually mostly a joke. Mostly. Usually it's just that I don't care for recent company, is whenever I get into one of those funks. So much of it depends on circumstance. I could be misanthropic in a crowd of yapping children, but if it's just people that'll be quietly together, just in the same, sharing a space, but not necessarily sharing breath, if you know what I mean, I'm totally fine with those sort of people. I could be with as many of those as need be. But once it gets to be a little bit too noisome, no, that's going to wake up to misanthropy. Alright, well, let's get into it. We want to try and get through one more chapter tonight. So the next one is The Beanfield. Meanwhile, my beans, the length of whose rows added together was 7 miles already planted, were impatient to be hoed, for the earliest had grown considerably before the latest were in the ground. Indeed, they were not easily to be put off. What was the meaning of this, so steady and self-respecting, this small Herculean labor, I knew not. I came to love my rows, my beans, though so many more than I wanted. They attached me to the earth, and so I got strength like Antaeus. But why should I raise them? Only heaven knows. This was my curious labor all summer, to make this portion of the earth's surface, which had yielded only cinquefoil, blackberries, johnswort, and the like before, sweet wild fruits and pleasant flowers, produce instead this pulse. What shall I learn of beans, or beans of me? I cherish them, I hoe them, I early and late, I have an eye to them, and this is my day's work. It is a fine broad leaf to look on. My auxiliaries are the dews and rains which water this dry soil, and what fertility is in the soil itself, which for the most part is lean and effete. My enemies are worms, cool days, and most of all woodchucks. The last have nibbled for me 1/4 of an acre clean. But what right had I to oust johnswort and the rest, and break up their ancient herb garden? Soon, however, the remaining beans will be too tough for them, and go forward to meet new foes. When I was 4 years old, as well as I well remember, I was brought from Boston to this my native town, through these very woods and this field, to the pond. It is one of the oldest scenes stamped on my memory, and now tonight my flute has waked the echoes over that very water. The pines still stand here older than I, or if some have fallen, I have cooked my supper with their stumps. And a new growth is rising all around, preparing another aspect for new infant eyes. Almost the same johnswort springs from the same perennial root in this pasture, and even I have at length helped to clothe that fabulous landscape of my infant dreams, and one of the results of my presence and influence is seen in these bean leaves, corn blades, and potato vines. I planted about 2 acres and a half of upland, and as it was only about 15 years since the land was cleared, and I myself had got out 2 or 3 cords of stumps, I did not give it any manure. But in the course of the summer, it appeared by the arrowheads which I turned up in the hoeing, that an extinct nation had anciently dwelled here, and planted corn and beans ere white men came to clear the land, and so, to some extent, had exhausted the soil for this very crop. before yet any woodchuck or squirrel had run across the road, or the sun had got above the shrub oaks. While all the dew was on, though the farmers warned me against it, I would advise you all to do your work, if possible, while the dew is on. I began to level the ranks of haughty weeds in my bean field, and throw dust upon their heads. Early in the morning I worked barefooted, dabbling like a plastic artist in the dewy and crumbling sand. But later in the day, sun blistered my feet. There the sun lighted me to hoe beans, pacing slowly backward and forward over that yellow gravelly upland, between the long green rows, 15 rods, the one end terminating in a shrub oak copse where I could rest in the shade, and the other in a blackberry field where the green berries deepened their tints by the time I had made another bout, removing the weeds, putting fresh soil about the bean stems, and encouraging this weed which I had sown, making the yellow soil express its summer thought in bean leaves and blossoms rather than in wormwood and piper and millet grass, making the earth say beans instead of grass. This was my daily work. As I had little aid from horses or cattle, or hired men or boys, or improved implements of husbandry, I was much slower and became much more intimate with my beans than usual. But labor of the hands, even when pursued to the verge of drudgery, is perhaps never the worst form of idleness. It has a constant and imperishable moral, and to the scholar it yields a classic result, a very agricola laborious. Was I to travelers, bound westward through Lincoln and Wayland, to nobody knows where. They, sitting at their ease in gigs, with elbows on knees and reins loosely hanging in festoons, I, the home-staying, laborious native of the soil, but soon my homestead was out of their sight and thought. It was the only open and cultivated field for a great distance on either side of the road, so they made the most of it, and sometimes the man in the field heard more of the traveler's gossip and comment than was meant for his ear. Beans so late? Peas so late? For I continued to plant when others began to hoe. The ministerial husbandman had not suspected it. Corn, my boy, for fodder. Corn for fodder. Does he live there? Asked the black bonnet of the gray coat, and the hard-featured farmer reins up his grateful Dobbin to inquire what are you doing where he sees no manure in the furrow, and recommends a little chipter, or any little waste stuff, or it may be ashes or plaster. But here were 2 acres and a half of furrows, and only a hoe for cart and 2 hands to draw it, there being an aversion to other carts and horses, and chipter far away. Fellow travelers, as they rattled by, compared it aloud with the fields which they had passed, so that I came to know how I stood in the agricultural world. This was one field not in Mr. Coleman's report, and by the way, who estimates the value of the crop which nature yields in the still wider fields unimproved by man? The crop of English hay is carefully weighed, the moisture calculated, the silicates and the potash, but in all dells and pond holes in the woods, pastures and swamps grows a rich and various crop only unreaped by man. Mine was, as it were, the connecting link between wild and cultivated fields. As some states are civilized, and others half-civilized, and others savage or barbarous, so my field was, though not in a bad sense. A half-cultivated field, they were beans cheerfully returning to their wild and primitive state that I cultivated, and my hoe played the Rance de Vache for them. Near at hand, upon the topmost spray of a birch, sings the brown thrasher, or red mavis, as some love to call him. All the morning, glad of your society, that would find out another farmer's field if yours were not here. While you are planting the seeds, he cries, drop it, cover it up, pull it up, pull it up, pull it up. But this was not corn, and so it was safe from such enemies as he. You may wonder what his rigmarole, his amateur Paganini performances on 1 string or on 20 have to do with your planting, and yet prefer it to leached ashes or plaster. It was a cheap sort of top dressing in which I had entire faith. As I drew a still fresher soil about the rows with my hoe, I disturbed the ashes of unchronicled nations who in primeval years lived under these heavens, and their small implements of war and hunting were brought to the light of this modern day. They lay mingled with other natural stones, some of which bore the marks of having been burned by Indian fires, some by the sun, and also bits of pottery and glass brought hither by the recent cultivators of the soil. When my hoe tinkled against the stones, the music that echoed to the woods and the sky and was an accompaniment to my labor which yielded an instant and immeasurable crop. It was no longer beans that I hoed, nor I that hoed beans, and I remembered with as much pity as pride, if I remembered at all, my acquaintances who had gone to the city to attend oratorios. The night hawks circled overhead in the sunny afternoons, for I sometimes made a day of it, like a mote in the eye, or in heaven's eye, falling from time to time with a swoop and a sound as if the heavens were rent, torn at the very last to very rags and tatters. And yet a seamless cope remained. Small imps that fill the air and lay their eggs on the ground on bare sand or rocks, or on the tops of hills where few have found them. Graceful and slender like ripples caught up from the pond, as leaves are raised by the wind to float in the heavens. Such kindredship is in nature. The hawk is aerial brother of the wave which he sails over and surveys, those his perfect air-inflated wings answering to the elemental, unfledged pinions of the sea. Or sometimes I watched a pair of henhawks circling high in the sky, alternately soaring and descending, approaching and leaving one another, as if they were the embodiment of my own thoughts. Or I was attracted by the passage of wild pigeons from this wood to that, with a slight quivering, winnowing sound and carrier haste. Or from under a rotten stump, my hoe turned up a sluggish, portentous, and outlandish spotted salamander, a trace of Egypt and the Nile, yet our contemporary. When I paused to lean on my hoe, these sounds and sights I heard and saw anywhere in the row, a part of the inexhaustible entertainment which the country offers. On gala days, the town fires its great guns, which echo like pop guns to these woods, and some waifs of martial music occasionally penetrate thus far. To me, away there in my bean field, at the other end of the town, the big guns sounded as if a puffball had burst. And when there was a military turnout of which I was ignorant, I have sometimes had a vague sense all the day of some sort of itching and disease in the horizon, as if some eruption would break out here soon, either scarlatina or canker rash, until at length some more favorable puff of wind making haste over the fields and up the Wayland road brought me the information of the trainers. It seemed by the distant hum as if somebody's bees had swarmed, and that the neighbors, according to Virgil's advice, by a faint tintinnabulum upon the most sonorous of their domestic utensils, were endeavoring to call them down into the hive again. And when the sound died quite away, and the hum had ceased, and the most favorable breezes told no tale, I knew that they had got the last drone of them all safely into the Middlesex hive, and that now their minds were bent on the honey with which it was smeared. I felt proud to know that the liberties of Massachusetts and of our fatherland were in such safe keeping, and as I turned to my hoeing again, I was filled with an inexpressible confidence, and pursued my labor cheerfully with a calm trust in the future. Then there were several bands of musicians. It sounded as if all the village was a vast bellows, and all the buildings expanded and collapsed alternately with a din. But sometimes it was a really noble and inspiring strain that reached these woods, and the trumpet that sings of fame, and I felt as if I could spit a Mexican with a good relish. For why should we always stand for trifles, and look round for a woodchuck or a skunk to exercise my chivalry upon? These martial strains seemed as far away as Palestine, and reminded me of a march of crusaders on the horizon, with a slight tantivy and a tremulous motion of the elm tree tops which overhang the village. This was one of the great days, though the sky had from my clearing only the same everlastingly great look that it wears daily, and I saw no difference in it. It was a singular experience, that long acquaintance which I cultivated with beans. What with planting and hoeing and harvesting and threshing and picking over and selling them, the last was the hardest of all. I might add eating, for I did taste. I was determined to know beans. When they were growing, I used to hoe from 5 o'clock in the morning till noon, and commonly spent the rest of the day about other affairs. Consider the intimate and curious acquaintance one makes with various kinds of weeds. It will bear some iteration in the account, for there was no little iteration in the labor, disturbing their delicate organization so ruthlessly, and making such invidious distinctions with his hoe, leveling whole ranks of one species, sedulously cultivating another. That's Roman wormwood, that's pigweed, that's sorrel, that's piperglass. Have at him, chop him up, turn his roots upward to the sun, and don't let him have a fiber in the shade. If you do, he'll turn himself to another side up, and be as green as a leek in 2 days. A long war, not with cranes, but with weeds. Those Trojans who had sun and rain and dews on their side. Daily the beans saw me come to their rescue, armed with a hoe, and thin the ranks of their enemies, filling up the trenches with the weedy dead. Many a lusty crest-waving Hector that towered a whole foot above his crowning comrades fell before my weapon and rolled in the dust. Those summer days, which some of my contemporaries devoted to the fine arts in Boston or Rome, and others to contemplation in India, and others to trade in London or New York, I thus, with the other farmers of New England, devoted to husbandry. Not that I wanted beans to eat, for I am by nature a Pythagorean, so far as beans are concerned, whether they mean porridge or voting, and exchange them for rice, but perchance, as some must work in fields if only for the sake of tropes and expression, to serve a parable maker one day. It was on the whole a rare amusement, which continued too long, might have become a dissipation. Though I gave them no manure, and did not hoe them all at once, I hoed them unusually well, as far as I went, and was paid for it in the end. There being in truth, as Evelyn says, no compost or litation whatsoever comparable to this continual motion, repastination, and turning of the mold with the spade. The earth, he adds elsewhere, especially if fresh, has a certain magnetism in it, by which it attracts the salt, power, or virtue, call it either, which gives it life, and is the logic of all labor and stir we keep about it. To sustain us, all dungings and other sordid temperings being put the vicar's succedaneous to this improvement. Moreover, this being one of those worn out and exhausted layfields which enjoy their Sabbath. YouTube, be nice. YouTube. Okay, I think we're back. Alright, yep, we're looking good. Moreover, this being one of those worn-out and exhausted layfields which enjoy their Sabbath, had perchance, as Sir Kenelm Digby thinks likely, attracted vital spirits from the air. I harvested 12 bushels of beans. But to be more particular, for it is complained that Mr. Coleman has reported chiefly the expensive experiments of gentlemen farmers, my outgoes were, for a hoe, 54 cents. Plowing, harrowing, and furrowing, $7.50. Too much. Beans for seed, $3.12.5. Potatoes for seed, $1.33. Peas for seed, 40 cents. Turnip for seed, 6 cents. White line for crow fence, 2 cents. Horse cultivator and boy, 3 hours, $1. Horse and cart to get crop, 75 cents. In all, $14.72.5. My income was patrum familias vensedum non emassem esse oporte. From 9 bushels and 12 quarts of beans sold, $16.94. 5 bushels large potatoes, $2.50. 9 bushels small potatoes, $2.25. Grass, $1. Stalks, 75 cents. In all, $23.44. Leaving of pecuniary profits, as I have elsewhere said, of $8.71.5. This is the result of my experience in raising beans. Plant the common small white bush bean about the 1st of June in rows 3 feet by 18 inches apart, being careful to select fresh, round, and unmixed seed. First, look out for worms, and supply vacancies by planting anew. Then, look out for woodchucks, if it is in an exposed place, for they will nibble off the earliest tender leaves almost clean as they go, and again when the young tendrils make their appearance. They have notice of it, and will shear them off with both buds and young pods, sitting erect like a squirrel. But above all, harvest as early as possible, if you would escape frosts and have a fair of saleable crop. You may save much loss by this means. This further experience also I gained. I said to myself, I will not plant beans and corns with so much industry another summer, with such seeds, if the seed is not lost, as sincerity, truth, simplicity, faith, innocence, and the like, and see if they will not grow in this soil, even with less toil and manurance, and sustain me, for surely it has not been exhausted for these crops. Alas, I said this to myself, but now another summer is gone, and another, and I am obliged to say to you, reader, that the seeds which I planted, if indeed they were the seeds of those virtues, were worm-eaten, or had lost their vitality, and so did not come up. Commonly, men will only be brave as their fathers were brave, or timid. This generation is very sure to plant corn and beans each new year, precisely as the Indians did centuries ago and taught the first settlers to do, as if there were a fate in it. I saw an old man the other day, to my astonishment, making the holes with a hoe for the 70th time at least, and not for himself to lie down in, but why should not the New Englander try new adventures, and not lay so much stress on his grain, his potato and grass crop, and his orchards? Raise other crops than these. Why concern ourselves so much about our beans for seed, and not be concerned at all about a new generation of men? We should really be fed and cheered if when we met a man we were sure to see that some of the qualities which I have named, which were all prized more than those of other productions, but which are for the most part broadcast and floating in the air, had taken root and grown in him. Here comes such a subtle and ineffable quality, for instance, as truth or justice, though the slightest amount of new variety of it along the road. Our ambassadors should be instructed to send home such seeds as these, and Congress help to distribute them all over the land. We should never stand upon ceremony with sincerity. We should never cheat and insult and banish one another by our meanness. If there were present the kernel of worth and friendliness, we should not meet thus in haste. Most men I do not meet at all, for they seem not to have time. They are busy about their beans. We would not deal with a man thus plodding ever, leaning on a hoe or a spade or as a staff between his work, not as a mushroom, but partially risen out of the earth, something more than erect, like swallows alighted and walking on the ground. And as he spake, his wings would now and then spread, as he meant to fly, then close again, so that we should suspect that we might be conversing with an angel. Bread may not always nourish us, but it always does us good. It even takes stiffness out of our joints, and makes us supple and buoyant, when we knew not what ailed us. To recognize any generosity in man or nature, to share any unmixed and heroic joy. Ancient poetry and mythology suggest, at least, that husbandry was once a sacred art, but it is pursued with irreverent haste and heedlessness by us, our object being to have large farms and large crops merely. We have no festival, no procession, and no ceremony, not excepting our cattle shows and so-called Thanksgivings, by which the farmer expresses a sense of sacredness of his calling, or is reminded of its sacred origin. It is the premium and the feast which tempt him. He sacrifices not to Ceres and the terrestrial Jove, but to the infernal Plutus rather, by avarice and selfishness and a groveling habit from which none of us is free, of regarding the soil as property, or the means of acquiring property chiefly. The landscape is deformed, husbandry is degraded with us, and the farmer leads the meanest of lives. He knows nature but as a robber. Cato says that the prophets of agriculture are particularly pious or just, maximique pius castus. And according to Varro, the old Romans called the same earth mother and Ceres, and thought that they who cultivated it led a pious and useful life, and that they alone were left of the race of King Saturn. We are wont to forget that the sun looks on our cultivated fields and on the prairies and forests without distinction. They all reflect and absorb his rays alike, and the former make but a small part of the glorious picture which he beholds in his daily course. In his view, the earth is all equally cultivated like a garden. Therefore, we should receive the benefit of his light and heat with a corresponding trust and magnanimity. That, though I value the seed of these beans, and harvest that in the fall of the year, this broad field which I have looked at so long looks not to me as the principal cultivator, but a way for me to influences more genial to it, which water and make it green. These beans have results which are not harvested by me. Do they not grow for woodchucks partly? The ear of wheat, in Latin spica, obsoletely speca, from spe, hope, should not be the only hope of the husbandman. Its kernel or grain, granum, granate, gerendo bearing, is not all that it bears. How then can our harvest fail? Shall I not rejoice also at the abundance of the weeds whose seeds are the granary of the birds? It matters little comparatively whether the fields fill the farmer's barns. The true husbandman will cease from anxiety, as the squirrels manifest no concern whether the woods will bear chestnuts this year or not, and finish this labor with every day relinquishing all claim to the produce of his fields, and sacrificing in his mind not only his first, but his last fruits also. And that brings us to the end of this chapter, the bean field. I mean, he's a hobby farmer that's trying to make himself seem like a dyed-in-the-wool, generational man of the land. So I shouldn't really be surprised that he's taking a holier-than-thou stance about beans. But, Thoreau. As someone who grew up in and around a lot of farms, there's always a certain charm to tracking the seasons as they come and go, watching the crops come in, and as they grow. We always used to say, like, knee high by the 4th of July for the corn and things like that. So it's nice to see that sort of connection with nature in this, but he seems very much to be pushing a little hard on that, pressing the point a little bit further than he probably rightly could or should. He's not a farmer. He's a man in the woods with a garden. But, it's Thoreau. We shouldn't be too surprised that he's taking his own position and raising it himself on a pedestal. Well. Alright, guys, it is... Yeah, it is not... That's an interesting take. The weeds have no less value than the crops. Because, it's in the grand scheme of things, the only difference between the two is that you chose to grow one. You're winnowing them out otherwise. As far as the world is concerned, they're all the same. Especially if you can make good use of the weeds, whether it be for fodder or fertilizer or just letting them out to compost. There's value in everything, and the world doesn't care. We care, the world does not. And that's something that we can all think of from time to time, that it's okay to be small. It's okay to not be the center of everything. Just as the weeds are just as important as the crops, we are just as important as the seemingly important people from the Golden Cities. Dandelion coffee actually works really well too. It's basically dandelion tea you do with the roots, and it's very dark and like coffee. And then dandelion leaves in tea are really good too. Or leaves in tea, or dandelion leaves in salad are really good. A little bitter, but a lot of times, sometimes you even go to like a hipster place and they'll throw like dandelion salad, and you wonder, like, all right, this is like the poorest of poor fare, but they're all of a sudden charging $20 for a salad because it's hip. So, alright guys, it is pushing 10 o'clock. I do need to step away, so we will call it here for the night. We are just south of halfway through the book, so we are making good progress. So we've probably got another, I'd say, realistically, 4 more sessions. So we'll get probably next weekend is when we'll come up on the end of this one. And I think I stand by my initial opinion. Thoreau is much better after the first chapter. Walden is much better after the first chapter, I should say. Thoreau is still annoying. I still find that he's pretentious and narcissistic and vain, but it's a little bit more palatable as we go on. We'll see if that trend continues, or if he'll return to being the preachy son of a gun that we started out with. It could go either way. Or maybe it's just that we've already become inured to the preachiness and it never really let up and we're just used to it. That is also entirely possible. This one didn't feel like much of a old men yelling at clouds night, though. It was more just suffering together. So, alright, thank you very much for joining us tonight, guys. Sorry for the hiccups as we began. tech and computer being as they will, sometimes they just decide not to cooperate. But we'll see if they keep up and whether we hold on and push through. We're so far so good. We just needed to get through that initial hiccup. Maybe it was the computer deciding to keep me humble, huh? Things have been going too well for too long. Anyway, let's call it a night here. I thank you again for joining us, and we will be back tomorrow for another reading from Walden. Have a great night, everyone. I hope it is safe from the storms that are running around here. So keep to yourselves and have a great night, and I hope to see you tomorrow.